Morning everyone. We're in week 4 now of our series on Genesis, the creation account. And just to briefly review our progress so far, day 1, God brings into existence the time, space, matter, and the basic elements are all created. God also set into motion the dark light cycle. That was the end of day 1. Day 2 we talked about last week. God separates the earth-based water from the water canopy above. So we've got the water canopy above the earth, and you've got the atmosphere, then you have the earth and the water that is on and in the earth. If you can imagine, under the surface of the earth it was like a water jacket, just like on a nuclear reactor, a water jacket. And that was day 2. But was God happy with what he'd done on day 2? No. He wasn't. Why not? It wasn't finished. Exactly right. The job was only half done, and that was a big takeaway last week, wasn't it? If God's not happy with a half-finished job, neither should we be.
Amen to that.
All right? Then day 3, we began last time. God separates the water on the earth from the land on the earth, and we have the separation. The land appears, and God said that it was good. So we left off at this point during the 3rd day of creation, if you like. It was morning tea. Right? And then God got onto it. He got going. And so in this environment, the earth with the dry lands and the oceans and atmosphere, and a blanket of water, or more likely probably water vapour or clouds surrounding the globe, is the basis for the pre-sin environment. Just remember, this is God's perfect world. Okay? God's perfect world. This is how he intended the earth to be. And to give us an idea of what this might look like, Dr. Henry Morris suggested several effects of a water vapour blanket around the earth. I don't think any of us really have any problem believing that there can be an awful lot of water up there, do we? Especially if you live in Sydney or the Gold Coast right now. Not the Gold Coast, the Sunshine Coast today. You know, they really got a hammering yesterday. There's an awful lot of water up there. So this is what Henry Morris suggests would be the effects. Firstly, it would serve as a global greenhouse, maintaining an essentially uniformly pleasant temperature all over the world. Secondly, without great temperature variations, there would be no significant winds, and the water-rain cycle could not form. There would be no rain as we know it today. Thirdly, there would be lush tropical-like vegetation all over the world, fed not by rain but by a rich evaporation and condensation cycle, resulting in heavy dew or ground fog. And fourthly, the vapour blanket would filter out ultraviolet radiation, excuse me, cosmic rays and other destructive energies that bombard the planet. These are known to be the cause of mutations which decrease human longevity. Human and animal lifespans would be greatly increased under that water vapour blanket. And lastly, a vapour blanket would provide the necessary reservoir for a potential worldwide flood. It's very interesting, the idea of what the environment and the weather was like before sin. It was perfectly set up to promote human life, and very different from what it is today. I might also mention the day was one dark light cycle, the evening and the morning, the evening and the morning, as we know it. And this is what the word day in Hebrew means. The word is yom. And the word yom refers to an ordinary day, not a dispensation, not an era, but it refers to a single 24-hour day. So let's continue with day number 3, shall we? Okay. Verse 11, and God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth, and it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. So we see here there's a division of land and water, a division of light and dark. And now God begins to cover the earth with vegetation to complete the work of day 3. Now, this is going to probably do your head in. It did mine in. This happened before the creation of the sun. The 4th day of creation. This means that the plants must have had sufficient nourishment because of the light God had created before the sun and the moon. Those who proposed these days of creation were not literal days but successive ages of slow evolutionary development have a real problem here. It's hard to explain how plants and all vegetation could grow and thrive eons before the sun and the moon. No modern evolutionist would argue that plant life is older than the sun or the moon. But this is what the Genesis record tells us. And it was so. This is the beginning of life on planet Earth, directly created by God and not slowly evolving over millions of years. Now, some scientists now say that life on Earth began when an immense meteorites carrying amino acids impacted the Earth at a time when the sun was cooler and the Earth was a watery ball covered with ice up to 1,000 feet thick. The idea is that a meteor hits the ice and breaks through and seeds the water underneath with the building blocks of life, which assemble into an organic soup and so forth. However the process was triggered, the scientists said life on Earth began in a geological instant. And by an instant they mean 10 million years or less. So it takes more faith to believe this than to believe in Genesis. You remember what I said, was it the first day? Frog plus 10 to the 48 years equals handsome prince? No. Frog plus kiss from beautiful princess equals handsome prince. That's much easier to believe, isn't it? It's easier to believe a fairy story than to believe in evolution, to be honest. The fossil evidence also demonstrates that life exploded into existence on Earth instead of slowly evolving. They even call it the Jurassic explosion. So, here we go. You like that? That there is how science tells us that vegetation arrived on planet Earth. Okay, so what we've got there, we've got phytoplankton. Doesn't tell us where the phytoplankton came from or how they were created or what. All right? That then evolved into red algae, which evolved into brown algae, which evolved into green algae, which made up its mind to creep out of the water and onto the dry land and become land plants, then conifers and giant tree ferns, and then regular trees, and then you can see we're going downhill from here. Right? We've got plants with seed and fruit, then back into the sea with mangroves, and the end of it all, we're back with seagrasses. Makes perfect sense, doesn't it? The earth brought forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the tree that yields fruit, whose seed is in itself. The plants were created not as seeds, but as full-grown plants, each bearing seeds. They were thus created as mature plants, having the appearance of age. So in answer to that age-old joke, the chicken really did come before the egg. Okay. According to its kind. This phrase appears 10 times in Genesis chapter 1. It means God allows variation within a kind, but something of one kind will never develop into something of another kind. And God saw that it was good. God knows what is good. He is not some vague moral neutral. He knows what is good and organises his creation to result in something good. God does not call the earth good until it becomes habitable, a place where people can live. A couple of interesting features of this particular act of creation. Genesis mentions 3 main classes of plant life. Now, science today doesn't talk about kinds. Science today talks about species and subspecies. Now, there might be different divisions according to science, but anyway, first of all, there's vegetation or grass. The Hebrew word is most often translated as grass in the Old Testament. Let the earth bring forth grass is an accurate translation of that verse. So I take it that the Bible is referring to the type of vegetation that covers close to the ground. Then he measures plants and herbs, so they can be bushes and shrubs, flowers and so forth, the second division. And lastly, the third of the trees and fruit trees, large woody plants, of course, including all the types of trees and all types of fruit-bearing trees. And God saw that it was good. And nowhere in that do we see how it started, what the mechanism for change is, or how some green algae decided to walk up out of the water onto dry land and start growing there, or how that little plant there, come on Peter, how that little plant there became that. There's no mechanism for that explained. I'll show you something else. When we're talking about this, we talk about kinds, according to its kind. So, okay, what does a kind look like? Well, that's a kind. Okay? And they're dogs. And we haven't got to dogs yet. It's day 6. But nevertheless, this is a kind. The original species was created with perfect genetics, remember. Perfect genetics. The genetics that would provide for all these different variations within that kind. All these animals, all these dogs can interbreed. That's why we have $5,000 designer mongrels, right? This is how they do it. And yet, there is no chance that that little thing there, which I suspect is probably a Shih Tzu or something.
Become a cat.
Exactly. The Bible expresses diversity in life as kinds. It's simple and readily easable to understand, right? These kinds can all breed within their own kind, but they can't interbreed with other kinds. You can't cross a dog with a cat, okay? Also, this account in Genesis mentions seed and fruit, referring to the ability of vegetation to reproduce itself and not some other type of thing, right? Vegetation, according to Genesis, can reproduce itself. The whole thing about species that scientists talk about is so complex. I researched this and I discovered there's a huge argument about what species actually are. Scientists themselves cannot agree as to what actually constitutes a species. And the crazy thing is that modern research into genetics reinforces the idea that each organism has its own unique structure of DNA and can only specify the reproduction of that same kind. You know, there's a great amount of variation within each kind, but there are no new kinds, are there? There is horizontal variation, colour, shape, size, form, but there are no vertical changes. In other words, plants cannot be bred to produce animals. There's none of this lower to higher thing. You can breed animals every which way, but you will never produce a plant or a tree. I know that sounds almost ridiculous, but the evolutionary mindset says that we all start from a common thing and then we kind of vertically go up. But the Bible says at the very beginning there is kind within kinds, but you can't generate one thing from a completely different kind. As I mentioned, evolution says that everything comes from a common ancestor, but this passage and just plain observation with your eyes demonstrates that each living thing has its own seed. Today we'd say each living thing has its own DNA. And so we give things a more complex term and we look into them more deeply to see their complexity, but the essence of the thing doesn't change, does it? Each produces after its own kind, and there are no new kinds. There are only variations of the original kind. There is no mechanism within the DNA of any type of cell yet discovered to increase the amount of information contained within its DNA. The only way they can do that is by gene splicing. Right? There is no natural way to increase the amount of information within the DNA of any cell. Unless, of course, you're a fan of Jurassic Park. When you see variations in kind, it's all about losing information rather than gaining information. What do I mean by that? I mean selective breeding. We know that selective breeding's anywhere. I was on a farm. We had selective breeding. We bred our dairy goats for specific characteristics. We wanted an udder, for example, that could be milked by a machine, not by hand. Very different. We wanted healthy animals. They had to be all white. Right? So these were the things we did. When we had cattle, we wanted small, compact animals that carried a lot of beef. So that's what we did. And this is selective breeding. Selective breeding to enhance specific characteristics is not evolution. What you're actually doing is removing parts of that particular kind's variations, right? Removing some of those options within the DNA to breed towards a specific animal that you're actually looking for. Like, you can never breed that Shih Tzu with any of those other breeds to go back to the original wolf, right? Because that information is gone. It's been gone for centuries, right? So this is the difference. Variations in kind are actually as a result of the loss of DNA, not of evolution. Another idea is that creation was done in a day, but what was created was fully mature. We've probably got some gardeners here, but we know when we plant a tree it's going to take a while, don't we? before we see the fruit and the flowers or whatever we planted that tree to do. We can tell the difference between a tree that's 12 months old and a tree that's 50 or 100 years old. They're very different. But when creation was made, all these trees and plants were fully mature. The trees and the plants, as well as all other created things, were made with their age built in. If we could go back, let's say, and bring our local GP along to creation with us, back to the very beginning, and he would examine Adam and Eve, he would say, well, this is a male around 20 years old, but it's not a baby, it's not a little child, it's not a prepubescent child, this is a grown man, and this here is a grown woman. And if he did a DNA check, he'd despair and hang up his stethoscope and never work again, because these two creatures were designed to live forever. Perfect DNA, remember? That was the original plan, perfect DNA. God creates a fully mature creation, and this explains the discrepancy in the ages that are sometimes observed by science, something that can take a certain number of years to develop to full maturity. Under the present environment that we have and the conditions that we have here on Earth now, this is a damaged Earth. We don't have that water blanket, that vapour blanket over us, creating that oxygen-rich, very humid environment with that beautiful warm temperature all over the Earth. But at the beginning, God called all these things into existence fully matured. The trees had to be mature, didn't they? Otherwise, what were Adam and Eve going to eat? There would have been no use them hanging around for 20 or 30 years for these plants to grow up before they had their first meal. God's not. For every living thing, there's a yesterday, a today and tomorrow. God's not in time, he controls time. He can make something with time built in already as a matter of fact. And some people cannot even figure out how things have been made simply because we live in time. Right? When did time start to exist? When God started the world spinning and there was light, evening and morning the first day. Time was created. Okay? So with the creation of the vegetation and the plant world, there's a close of the third day, as we see again. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the third day. So while God didn't say that the half-formed earth was good on the second day, he said it twice on day 3. Next week we'll look at number 4, day 4. So if we can draw any conclusions from day 3 of creation, the one thing it does do is eliminate any possibility of an evolutionary process. Because whatever the plant is and whatever the tree is, it can only reproduce after its own kind. To say that all living things come from a common ancestry is refuted by the 10 times repeated phrase, after its kind, after its kind, after its kind, all the way through. It was God's clear intention to provide us with a perfect world at the beginning. And let us not forget that it was humans who sinned and rebelled against God that brought the world into the state that it's in today. Jesus made it very clear that the Father has not forgotten us. Even though we were unfaithful, he is always faithful. It is his will to provide everything we need if we'll only get on board with the kingdom economy. We spoke about that a couple of weeks ago. He has provided for us a kingdom economy. Remember, the world's economy is taking and keeping, and the kingdom economy is giving and receiving. All right? Give, receive, give, receive, give, receive. It's simple. That's the kingdom economy. That's how the kingdom works. I'm just going to close this part of the service with this quote from Jesus in Luke 12. And he said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens, they neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? If then you are not able to do as small a thing as that, why are you anxious about the rest? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today and tomorrow thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? And do not seek what you are to eat and what you are to drink, nor be worried. For all the nations of the world seek after these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, seek first his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. Amen? Amen.